you for the longest introduction ever in the history of introductions. Hi, everyone. How are you guys? Good morning. Is it still? I think it's still morning. This is kind of short. Wow. Can you guys hear me if I talk like this? Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for having me here today. This is my first time moderating a panel and really doing anything like this at all, so I'm so happy to be here, and thank you to Neil and to Impact for having me here. I think that what Impact is doing is just so important and incredible, bringing together like-minded and forward-thinking entrepreneurs and leaders and trailblazers like all of you are. It is so important to nurture people in our community to do these things because we as South Asians have so much influence. Okay, I don't want to talk too much because we have some amazing panelists today that I want to ask a lot of questions to, and I'm sure you guys all have lots of questions of your own, and we will take questions at the end. Okay, but if I can say one thing, climate change is an uncomfortable topic, and it's overwhelming, and I believe that we are in a really unique place in time right now where the future is in our hands. And we really do have the power to change the course of the future for ourselves and for future generations. And I think that understanding each and every one of our own roles when it comes to the climate crisis is the first step towards combating it. For me, personally, I come from Hollywood, which is an extremely unsustainable industry as it is. And it has an urgent need to shift towards more sustainable storytelling and production. And sometimes all it takes is just speaking up, right? So, for example, I was on a set where I asked where I could recycle something, only to find out that they hadn't even thought about it yet. So after I asked that question, there were recycling bins placed all over a set. So something as simple and as basic as that can go such a long way. I really believe that individual actions have a ripple effect, and individual change does eventually lead to systemic change. My husband's smiling at me. We, as the diaspora, we collectively have not just the obligation, but we have the resources, we have the education, we have the brain power, and also the global mindset and perspective to really lead the way when it comes to combating the climate crisis. So I'm going to stop talking now and invite the amazing panelists up here. Can I get all of you to sit up here and I'll say your bios? Yay! Okay, so I'll read in order, I guess. Let's see. So right here we have Keya Chatterjee. She is the executive director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, a hyper-local elected official representing the H Street corridor of Washington, D.C., and author of the book, The Zero Footprint Baby, How to Save the Planet While Raising a Healthy Baby. Her work focuses on building an inclusive movement in support of climate action. Prior to joining USCAN, Keya worked on climate campaigns and policy at WWF, where she worked for 8 years. Before that, Keya was a climate change specialist at U.S. Agency of International Development. Keya also worked at NASA headquarters for 4 years, communicating research results on climate change. Keya was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco from 1998 to 2000. She serves on the boards of numerous organizations, including the Sunrise Movement and Evergreen Action. Keya received her master's degree in environmental science and her bachelor's in environmental science and Spanish from the University of Virginia. So get up for Keya. Okay, and next to her we have Manish. Manish Bapna, is President and Chief Executive Officer of the NRDC, also known as the National Resource Defense Council, one of the nation's most influential environmental groups, which works to ensure the rights of all people to clear air, clean water, and healthy and equitable communities. During his 25-year career, Bapna's leadership roles have focused on designing sustainable development strategies that are equitable, durable, and scalable. Most recently, he served as Executive Vice President and Managing Director of the World Resources Institute, a leading global research organization focused on the environment and development for more than 14 years. As NRDC's new president and CEO, Bapna joins the 51-year-old nonprofit of some 700 scientists, lawyers, and policy advocates around the globe to tackle the biggest environmental issues we face today. Okay, and next to him, Sorry, it's all out of order. Okay, next to him we have Varun Sivaram. Dr. Varun Sivaram is a physicist, best-selling author, and clean energy technology expert with experience spanning the corporate, public, and academic sectors. He currently leads Secretary Kerry's clean energy team in service of the Biden administration's international efforts to tackle the climate crisis through a swift transition to net zero emissions. And he spearheads several U.S. initiatives, including the First Movers Coalition. Previously, as Chief Technology Officer of Renew Power, Dr. Sivaram led research and development for a multi-billion-dollar company recognized as India's largest producer of renewable energy, as well as its most innovative energy company. A widely published scientist and innovation scholar, Sivaram has served on the faculty of Georgetown University and Columbia University. A Rhodes and Truman Scholar, Sivaram holds a PhD in condensed matter physics. What does that mean? From Oxford University and undergraduate degrees from Stanford University. And fun fact, Varun and I were high school buddies. Go Falcons. Okay. And last but certainly not least, we have Jigar Shah, Director of the Loans Program Office with the Department of Energy. Jigar Shah was most recently co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through the use of low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. Prior to Generate Capital, Shah founded Sun Edison, a company that pioneered pay-as-you-save solar financing. After Sun Edison, Shah served as the founding CEO of the Carbon War Room, a global nonprofit founded by Sir Richard Branson and Virgin Unite to help entrepreneurs address climate change. Originally from Illinois, Shah holds a BS from the University of Illinois UC and an MBA from the University of Maryland College Park. I told you they were experts, right? Okay, so I'm going to start with Manish. I have a question for you. So you have worked in the climate space for 25 years and are the president of one of the nation's leading environmental organizations. For people here who may not know too much about the current state of the climate crisis, I think we can all acknowledge that the climate crisis is real, hopefully in this room. Can you give us an overview of where we've been and where we are now, and what should every American and South Asian understand about the climate crisis?
Absolutely. Great to be here, and thank you for the very kind introduction. So I'm gonna presume that the science and the nature and the extent, severity of the climate crisis is probably pretty well accepted in this room. We are living in a particularly urgent moment. Scientific community over the past 20, 30, 40 years, 1.5 degrees centigrade has been seen as the threshold, after which, if we were to surpass that, we would start to experience risks that could lead to truly catastrophic global warming. Even where we are today, we're at about 1.2 degrees, again, in centigrade, and we see what's happening all around the world, right? You look at what's happening in India. March was the hottest month in India ever. Partners of ours working in India, there's laboring in temperatures of 50, 51, 52 degrees centigrade. It's absolutely problematic. So we have a very, very short window in terms of how to actually keep warming either under 1.5 degrees centigrade, or if we overshoot, we're going to need to find a way to bring it back to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The challenge is that the US has been one of the most negligent countries in terms of doing its fair share to tackle this problem. Most of you may know that President Biden made a laudable commitment for the US to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% by the year 2030, as of a 2005 baseline. So 50 to 52% below 2005. As of the end of 2021, last year, the US was at 17% below 2005 levels. So need to go from 17% below 2005 levels to 50 to 52%. One of the largest countries that is most off track in terms of what its fair share to tackle the climate crisis would be. A lot of the work that many of our organizations and many peer organizations have done is how do we actually then get there from where we are today? And at least there's kind of three important pieces to that. One is climate legislation, getting real strong clean energy legislation. One of the issues that probably should have come up a little bit more in the early morning session today. The second is about regulations, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that with some of the other colleagues here. And then the third is kind of state and local action. And so I would just say that the next few weeks, the next couple of months, one of the biggest topics to be keeping an eye out is whether or not we can get a bold climate and environmental justice package across the finish line in Congress. And the reason why this is just so important, one very last point, is that what we have also learned over the past few decades is that if we want to think about clean air and public health, if we want to think about the economy in terms of jobs and what makes good economic sense, if we want to think about energy security, taking action on climate has been seen as being able to achieve all of those while also having a very strong climate co-benefit. So these investments in clean energy make just a lot of sense. So just to underscore the urgency of the moment and that ability to kind of keep within 1.5 degrees, the next few months, the next couple of years, both in the US and around the world, are absolutely pivotal.
Thank you so much for that. I think it is such an important point, so many important points you made, but especially just highlighting and underscoring the urgent need of what we need to do today. And actually, it reminds me of a quote that I wrote down, and I wasn't sure if I was going to read it, but it just reminded me. So what you said about the US. The Western model of growth that India and China wish to emulate is intrinsically toxic. It uses huge resources, energy, and materials, and generates enormous waste. It remains many steps behind the problems it creates. India and China have no choice but to reinvent the development trajectory, and that's by Sunita Narain, who is a very renowned environmental, I'm sure you know who she is, environmental activist in India. So, okay, I think that actually leads really well into a question I have for Jigar. Jigar, in your role as Director of the Loans Program Office at the Department of Energy, you get to oversee the administration of loans to companies leading the way in creating innovative solutions to our climate and environmental crisis. You've announced some exciting projects, particularly in hydrogen, which I would love to know more about, and I'm sure everybody else here would as well. So could you please talk about that, as well as some of the other innovative technologies your office has provided loans for, and how they can help us tackle the crisis? And also, what is the role of the government in this process?
Yeah, thank you. I'm struck by how long I've known the folks in the panel and how hard we've been working at this. One of the things I'd say is that we as a culture are really obsessed with invention, right? So invention is generally overrated, and we're not as obsessed with implementation, right, which is very much underrated, right? And so all the news stories, all the things are like, this got announced and this is amazing, or these guys raised $500 million, or this guy did whatever. And I think what we need to really get to is a place where we actually as a culture understand how to implement the solutions that we've already invented, right? And that's a lot of what my office does. And so the latest projects that we've announced on hydrogen are, one company uses methane pyrolysis to basically break the bond between a carbon and hydrogen, sort of in a methane molecule. And this technology is 25 years old, right? So it's not new technology, it's just never been commercialized at scale, right? And then because of the Ukraine crisis, this technology has now taken on international and national security importance, because the largest exporter of carbon black in the world, which is used to make your tires, even for your electric vehicle, is from Russia, right? And so we need to start making it here, and we can do it through this technology. And then you have hydrogen as your byproduct. So the hydrogen is practically free actually out of this process. And so now you have really cheap hydrogen, and guess what else we can use a lot more of? Fertilizer. So they're going to turn the hydrogen into fertilizer. And so these kinds of technologies are things that we at the Department of Energy have invested in for decades. But the ability to commercialize them has been just really difficult to do. The other technology we did the other day was the ACES technology, which is basically electrolyzers putting hydrogen into a salt dome. And just to give you the scale of it, the batteries that we expect to put on the grid by 2030, cumulative, will store about 150 gigawatt hours of energy. which is about 1 year's of production from the Ford F-150's battery manufacturing plant. This hydrogen salt dome alone will store 150 gigawatt hours just in this one salt dome, right? So I think when you think about just the sheer scale of what you can do with hydrogen versus lithium-ion batteries, it's 100x to 1, right? And so I think but a lot of what we're talking about here, and even with your comment, I think, around India and China, which is that we actually know how to do this stuff better, right? India can absolutely leapfrog what America had to go through to create a modern lifestyle. But figuring out exactly who's supposed to implement these solutions and how that happens and who gets trained to do it. I mean, right now, for instance, if you want to put a heat pump in your house, the local HVAC tech probably isn't trained to do it, right? And so then you have to wait 3 months because that person's not trained to do it, right? So I feel like we have these great big messages, like we all need to install heat pumps or we all need to do whatever, but then figuring out how these folks get trained, how you actually get the supply chain going, how you get all these other things done is sort of lacking after the policy paper is written.
Thank you. That actually leads to another question I wanted to ask you, which was, you talked about how it's been difficult to make these on a commercial scale. So what do you think is needed to make these promising technologies reach a commercial scale and where private investors will feel comfortable investing on their own?
Yeah, I think it goes to your previous question around the government's role. And ultimately, I think that, we've had a really hard time in this country for the last, pick a number, let's call it 30 or 40 years, on supporting manufacturing, right? Because ultimately, if you're a manufacturing company, you want to sell out your factory, right? And so the notion that you're going to take a new technology and create a big factory and then hope and pray that people will actually accept the technology and buy it is very difficult and very scary. It's something that, the Germans and the Canadians and the Chinese and others have done for a long time.
Yeah.
But not something that we've done. And so I think you see so many tools within the US government that people are starting to talk about, right? Whether it's the Defense Production Act or whether it's federal procurement itself, right? Or whether it's other tools that we have. I mean, Varun's running one of the main ones with the First Movers Coalition, where he's creating a huge amount of demand from large corporates. And so, I think part of this is just understanding that there isn't a one-line answer to the question. It's going to be different for electrolyzers, different for solar panels, different for heat pumps, different for insulation, different for, critical minerals, et cetera, et cetera. But we just have to do the hard work now to figure out what role does the government play to provide some de-risking, and what role does the private sector play to actually take the risk that they're supposed to take, along with the rewards that they get.
Right, and I think that we can transition to Varun, who I think can speak a little bit more about that. Varun, even if we achieved these dream policies in the United States to drastically reduce our nation's footprint, the fate of our planet still depends on what countries like China and India do to develop sustainably without making the same mistakes that countries like the US made after we had major technological and industrial growth. So you set up the US-India Climate Action and the CTO and partnership under Secretary Kerry, and you actually used to work in India as the CTO of India's biggest renewable company. Why is India's clean energy transition so important, and what can the U.S. do to help?
Yeah, thanks, Richa. Let me first say thanks to Impact for hosting this, to Neil and Sivakami for what you're pulling off. And Richa, look, we've known each other for, 20 years? You are such an inspiration to aspiring actors and for your activism.
Thank you.
So thanks for what you've done.
Thank you. This isn't about me, though.
She got me. So the question's a great one, which is the way we think about climate change. It's a global problem. And really, even though what Manish said is absolutely true, the United States has not done its historical fair share. Looking ahead, more than 90%, likely 95% of the future emissions that we will need to avoid are not going to be in the United States. They'll be outside of the United States. And so there's only so much we can do by reducing our own emissions. Now, what Jigar's doing is actually has global impact, right? If what Jigar can demonstrate is hydrogen at great scale, that's extensible all over the world. So bringing these promising technologies to great scale is an extraordinary way that the US can help the rest of the world. Another way is through diplomacy. And as you mentioned, the United States, through Secretary Kerry, leads a range of climate partnerships with countries around the world. In fact, after 4 years in the wilderness, I'll be blunt here, 4 years in the wilderness, President Biden put the US back in the game on climate diplomacy. On day one, we rejoined the Paris Agreement. 100 days in, President Biden convened a summit of all the world leaders. Secretary Kerry led our delegation to the big climate summit last November in Glasgow. And ahead of that, we had 65% of the world by GDP signing up to targets. Manish mentioned the United States' target, but 65% of the world by GDP signed up to targets that were consistent with what Manish said, the 1.5 degree trajectory and net zero by 2050. We still got 35% of the way to go. And actually, I'm being a little bit glib because by emissions, we still got a majority of the world to go, not by GDP. And India is one of those critical puzzle pieces. China, of course, is the biggest puzzle piece, right? If China waits until 2030 to peak its emissions, the rest of the world needs to accelerate its date to hit net zero from 2050 to 2035. That's infeasible. So China's got to reduce way faster than 2030. But India is the next challenge. India will be, on current projections, the world's second largest emitter by 2040. And we have a big opportunity in working with India to help them to do exactly what you said, Richa, avoid that industrialization pathway that frankly is better for both India and for us. As all of you know, 9 out of 10 of the most polluted cities in the planet are in India. And so what we're doing with them is kind of a 3-step strategy. And we've brought in a range of other partners around the world. The first part of the strategy is to help India build a ton of renewable energy. Prime Minister Modi has this goal of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil fuel power capacity this decade. We're helping him to get there. Second thing we're doing is taking that renewable energy capacity and using it all over the economy. Right now, you can use it for applications that use power, like air conditioning. And that's really important in India. But you also want to be able to use it to, for example, produce hydrogen that can then reduce their steel emissions, to reduce their fertilizer emissions. And then the third thing, so the first is produce renewables, the second is use renewables, and the third is use energy efficiency. If India continues to build out cooling at the rate that it's projected to, it'll add a whole Europe worth of power demand. That's infeasible, right? So I think the United States and this key partnership with India, or what we're doing with South Africa, what we're doing with Indonesia, what Secretary Kerry has said is it is our responsibility and what we want to do to help each of these countries to decarbonize, to ideally do it with American technologies, and to do it in such a way that the countries are better off than if they followed a different development pathway. And that's why I'm so excited about the India partnership.
That's so amazing. And, you know, it's so interesting to me because I think so many people in this room can agree with me. You know, we all come from different places. Some of us are from India or other places of South Asia or the world. And so many of our ancestors were the pioneers of sustainable living, zero waste living. And it's only now that life is so different for people in India. And it's almost like we have to learn from the past and go back to our origins and how we used to live. So I think it's really interesting that now the US has to partner with India to almost teach them how to go back to their old way of life. Okay, Keya, I have a really good question for you. The impacts of climate change disproportionately hurt the most. Actually, sorry, before we get to that, Varun, I wanted to quickly follow up. We talked briefly about the first coalition movement, and I know that you and Jigar are now working on that together. Can you please talk more about that? Because you told me a little bit about it, and I think it's so exciting. I'm so sorry, Keya. We'll come right to you afterwards.
I'll be super brief because I also want to hear from Keya. Thank you for asking, Richa. So the First Movers Coalition is something that President Biden launched last November at this big climate summit in the UK. And what it is it's inspired by what has happened with a range of other sectors. Why do we have life-saving vaccines? Why do we have commercial space flight? It's because advance purchasing commitments, early demand signals were sent. Governments said, we promise to buy doses of vaccines. NASA said, we promise to buy your space services. If SpaceX, you can make something that meets our needs. And with that firm demand commitment came the development and scale of these technologies that otherwise had not reached commercial markets. We're trying to do the same thing for clean energy technologies now. The First Movers Coalition, which we will do a major expansion of next week, so I'll give you a preview. At Davos, we'll announce that more than 50 companies representing more than 10% of the Fortune Global 2000 by market cap, so the biggest companies in the world, are all committing to buy near zero carbon products. Could be near zero carbon steel, near zero carbon aluminum, devices to suck carbon right out of the atmosphere, clean shipping, clean aviation, clean trucking. And that's creating early market demand for technologies that, as Jigar said, are invented. They just haven't gotten to the scale they need to get to in this decade for us to really tackle the challenge. And that innovation is what we are trying to induce through the First Movers Coalition. I'm delighted by the effort that Jigar, who invests in the supply of the technologies that these companies can buy, is now partnering with the First Movers Coalition, and that countries around the world, Norway last week announced on a trip that Secretary Kerry made, Norway announced that they would formally endorse and partner with the United States and President Biden on the First Movers Coalition. So my hope is we will have, in this decade, between now and 2030, a series of these technologies that haven't yet gotten the investment they need, but suddenly will, because the innovators and the investors say, wow, there's really firm demand, because Volvo promised me that they will make 10% of their steel purchases come from near zero carbon steel. And there's only one near zero carbon steel facility in the whole world. It's in Sweden. We need 50 this decade. That demand will drive the investment in the new infrastructure. Thanks, Richa.
I think that's so brilliant, and I just want to give a round of applause to all of you guys. I mean, I'm just so proud to see our people, our South Asian people, doing this work and leading the way, and to see you guys working together, like it makes me so happy. So let's just give them a round of applause. Okay, Keya, now it's your turn. The impacts of climate change disproportionately hurt the most vulnerable communities, including women, communities of color, and those who are not able to advocate for themselves. I think a lot of people don't understand that climate change is actually a social justice issue. Can you please tell us about the work of U.S. Climate Action Network, and specifically talk about the importance of inclusion and dismantling racial injustice when it comes to combating climate change?
Sure, thank you. And I know you said it's not about you, but I'm not sure if I would have come if it wasn't for you. So it's actually totally about you. Big fan.
Thank you. Ditto.
I actually totally would have come for all of you too. We have been talking a lot about technology, and oftentimes climate change can seem like a really daunting topic to delve into, because there's there's a lot of chemistry and physics, and we've been talking a lot about numbers, which can also be daunting to delve into. But fundamentally, this is an issue of justice. Mm-hmm. That's what it is at its core. So at the session earlier, we heard Congressman Ro Khanna talking about how his grandparents were part of the Indian independence movement. My grandfather was also in jail as part of that movement. The struggle for climate justice is more akin to that struggle than it is to anything that anyone will learn in a science discipline, including me, which is part of why I left a awesome job at NASA to join the climate movement, because it was a realization that this is a justice issue. It's great. It's wonderful to deploy. I've got an LG Chem battery and solar panels. I've got mini splits and heat pumps. We gotta deploy. Absolutely, it's necessary. But we also have to understand there are villains here.
Yes.
There are bad guys. There are people who define the common sense of this country. There are fossil fuel oligarchs that are they form a common sense in this country, along with warmongering imperialists and white nationalists and people who don't want women to have basic rights. And that common sense still holds in this country today, and that's why it's hard for us to actually deploy. Every single thing that we do on climate change gets fought, and it's because the system is set up for a few people to make a lot of money. And there was a great piece on that John Oliver did on Sunday about utilities and how these are monopolies. Even if you love capitalism, these are monopolies. They own and operate every single state legislature, and they prevent us from saving our people, and they make us pay for it. They're literally poisoning us and making us pay for it, and they can do it because they have bought the regulators. They have bought the legislators. And so the idea that you could deal with the climate crisis without dealing with a range of other social justice issues is just not true. Mm-hmm. It is fundamentally colonialism why we even have this issue. I mean, like, if people of European descent hadn't decided to go all around the world and spread, you were just saying, like, there still are sustainable ways of living in India. And so I often think, why aren't we learning more from India? Because because like people there still like figure out how to get around on bikes in some places, although now the pathway has gotten so wild, like in Kolkata, where my family's from, they made it illegal to ride a bicycle in Kolkata. We're trying to move the opposite way. But every single time you build a bike lane, which is what I do in my like hyper-local, elected official role, it is fought. And it is fought by an entrenched system. Every time you try and put solar somewhere, it is fought. And it's fought because the system is stacked against us. And that system is there because we allowed there to be sacrifice zones. We said it was okay to sacrifice black communities, to sacrifice brown communities, to sacrifice Asian communities. We said it's okay to put a Chevron facility in Richmond, California. We said it's okay to poison people. Right now, there are communities in the US Southeast where there are wood chip factories that are making wood chips that are being sent to Europe that qualify for Europe's climate policy, the emissions trading system. Their communities are getting poisoned today for climate policy. And it's because we have felt these communities are things that are places and people we can sacrifice. And those are our members. And I also will be a little different from this panel in saying that like this administration has been a great disappointment to me on these issues. I mean, I was like standing out there trying to block Line 3 along with all of our colleagues, tar sands pipeline through indigenous land. This is stuff that could be blocked. These liquefied natural gas terminals that are getting approved, these are things that the fossil fuel administration was trying to get done under Trump, couldn't get done, and they're getting done now. And I understand there's a war, but like I work for US Climate Action Network. My colleague who runs the Ukrainian Climate Action Network is begging us not to do this. Every single dollar we spend on fossil fuels is falling in the form of bombs on their heads. We have to get off this stuff. It is dirty, it is gross, it is killing people, and it's killing the people in our network, in the US Climate Action Network.
Thank you. I love your passion, and I feel you. I think it's such an important perspective that we really needed on this panel, and I think it could open a whole debate, but I'm just so glad you said what you said, and I agree with so much of what you said. And that actually, how much time is Neil here? How much time do I have time for?
Yes, you do.
Great, okay, then I'm gonna ask a question that I really wanna ask, which is pretty much very related to what you were talking about. I strongly believe that climate change is a social justice issue, and it is an issue that is rooted in supremacy and racism and systemic, all of those things, supremacy and racism. And also, something that nobody ever talks about is the impact of animal agriculture. I'm a huge animal rights activist, so it is my obligation to talk about this in a climate panel. Manish, this question's for you. As someone who understands the urgent need to transform our food systems and farming practices, which are completely unsustainable at the moment, I have a question for you. The impacts of the energy, fossil fuel, and transportation industries currently dominate climate mitigation discussions among global leaders, while animal agriculture, one of the leading contributors to climate change, is sidelined from discussions at best and ignored at worst. Scientific consensus shows that animal agriculture and factory farming are responsible for up to 16.5% of global emissions and a major cause of deforestation, land degradation, biodiversity loss, and ocean dead zones, not to mention a major threat to public health and a cause of pandemics. A paper published in Nature Food shows that if the populations of high-income nations like the US switch to a plant-based diet, or at least a plant-forward diet, annual emissions from these countries' agricultural production could drop by more than 60%. A study by the University of Chicago found that going plant-based is 50% more effective in fighting climate change than switching from a standard car to a hybrid car. Can you speak about why a topic like animal agriculture is continuously left out of the climate crisis conversation, and why are the realities of industrial factory farming so hidden from the public?
Great. There's actually so much in this conversation that we could pick
There's
up
so much
on
passion in this room right now. Can you guys feel it?
Really, I mean, I really enjoyed everyone's comments, and there's lots of kind of important threads to kind of take out in this. So if we have time, I'd love to do that. But let me turn to. I just wanted one small point, just building on what Keya said regarding the fossil industry, and then I'll just talk about animals. Perhaps one of the most brazen kind of criminal kind of conversations that are taking place today is how, trying to build on what Keya said, the fossil industry leveraging the crisis in Ukraine to advocate for more drilling, more infrastructure as a means to solve short-term energy problems in Europe. It absolutely makes no sense. It is abusing a real challenge, how you actually ensure Europe has reliable, secure energy for the coming winter and the coming 2 or 3 years, with we need to build more infrastructure which won't get to market for 5-7 years and would lock us in ways that are inconsistent with what the European countries want, what these companies have ostensibly signed up for, and what the world needs to do to keep 1.5 degrees. So just one of those areas that I think is particularly really problematic in the conversation taking place in Washington today. So part of the reason why animal agriculture, kind of the meat industry, has avoided the scrutiny, and you're absolutely right about the numbers. If you look at both, and the reason why, it's basically because the feed for livestock oftentimes is grown globally, and oftentimes is done in ways where you cut down forests in order to grow the feed, the soy in particular. And that creates an incredible amount of emissions, very inefficient way to produce calories for animals, and then the animals themselves, livestock, actually emit a lot of methane, which creates a lot of emissions, and then the fertilizers that's used both for the plants and for the livestock create emissions. So you're absolutely right, the scale. If you added up, this is a nice little, if you added up all the cows in the world and just looked at the emissions that the cows emitted, it would be the China, US, and then like cow nation, right? And then India and the EU in terms of scale of emissions just from cows.
Crazy.
So this is a very, very significant issue. Why do we not talk about this? First, most people think about emissions, they think about the energy sector. They don't think about the land use sector. Second, this appears, particularly in this country, to touch a third rail. How can you come and talk to me about what I eat?
Exactly.
Yes, you can talk about solar and wind, and maybe we can now talk about electric cars. But when you talk about what I can eat, gosh, that's going much too far. So strong industry lobby, inability to have the space to have that conversation. And it comes back to a Western, I mean, this is where India, and actually what India has tried to take to the world is about sustainable lifestyles. A conversation, a narrative about coming back. Again, it's not about the US teaching India, it's about India and many times the developing world teaching the West about what more sustainable lifestyles would actually look like. One of the things that I think we need to be doing in terms of how we shift diets is really to think a lot more about plant-based diets and alternative proteins, and how I think one of the things that this country can actually do to kind of upend this crisis is kind of the alternatives. So if solar and wind is trying to take down fossils, does plant-based diets, alternative proteins, the Impossible Burgers, can that take down the meat industry? And I think there's a lot of potential there that we should be exploring aggressively.
Thank you so much for saying that. And you touched upon this, but I think even I've only been plant-based or vegan for the past 2 years, and I understand it's not something that's easy for everybody to do, and it's a sensitive topic. I myself used to love meat, used to love dairy, and didn't want to give up cheese or yogurt or pizza. I still love pizza, by the way, and I just want to say that there are amazing vegan options out there, especially today. So there's really no excuse to not at least try it. And if you can't completely cut out animal products, you can still eat. Animal products are in everything. It's in our clothing, it's in our skincare products, it's in our makeup, it's in literally everything. So you can at least try to be conscious, be a conscious consumer, not just about animal products, but about everything. Because when you're a conscious consumer, you send a massive message to the markets and the greedy corporations that profit off of these things. And when we're conscious about what we consume and what we buy, then we get better products from these companies. So thank you for saying that. And
if I could
yes,
just wait,
please.
I just want to share, I thought this was a very fascinating thing, that there's a tick. Did you guys see this? There's a tick that makes people allergic to meat. And I was just like, wow, that is like the quintessential Mother Nature fighting back.
I hope that tick gets everyone.
It's real. I think I read a novel where it gets released.
It's going to be in your next science fiction book. I mean, one thing I'd add to that, Richa, like,
yes, please.
I mean, I think honestly the big challenge we have, and Asian Americans in particular who've immigrated to this country, I think, face this more than most, right? Is that a lot of folks came to this country obviously to seek a better life and absolutely bought into it, right? And I think culture absolutely encourages it, right?
Yes.
There are the whole vegan, vegetarian stuff. I'm vegetarian and, oftentimes trying to go vegan. It's not really promoted that well on Food Network or other places, right? I mean,
We've been brainwashed.
Right, but but even induction stoves are not, right? Like when you think about the number of people who've come to me and said, I think my food tastes worse in an induction stove versus a gas powered stove. And I'm like, seriously, that's not how anything works.
It's all mental.
That's not how anything works, right? But the same thing's true for vehicles, right? So my office is funding all of the electric vehicle manufacturing facilities in the United States, right?
Amazing.
The Ford F-150 truck uses a 125 kilowatt hour battery. The Honda Ioniq, or some of these other cars that got New York auto show car of the year, is a 66 kilowatt hour battery pack, right? So even if you're thinking about supply chains, critical minerals, all that stuff, right? Buying a Honda Ioniq electric vehicle is half the battery pack of a Ford F-150 truck, right? But Ford did it because a lot of people want to buy those trucks, right? And then the same thing's true for houses, right? Our houses are now an average of 1,500 square feet larger than they were, whatever it was, 25, 30 years ago, right? And that's what everybody wants. I mean, when I go to dinner parties, people are like, our house, it just doesn't work. The breezeway is not large enough. We don't have a mud room. We need this other thing, right? I mean, it's a very typical thing, right? But this is a cultural thing, right? And all of that uses energy. It all uses resources. It all uses things. And so I think it's important for all of us to recognize, look, I appreciate what Keya is saying, and I totally agree with what you're saying. But I do think that this shift that the oil industry has done around personal choice is where the problem is, right? All of the choices that you have should be systemically better than the choices you make. Recycling shouldn't be a choice. We should have extended producer responsibility, right? Building code shouldn't be a choice. There should be regulations that actually make buildings net zero. And so I do think that one of the big challenges here is that we allow for this sort of personal carbon footprint calculator. Who the hell cares?
Yeah.
Right? We shouldn't extend I-270 and make it broader. Right? That's what you should be working on instead of calculating your personal carbon footprint calculator. And so I do think that there's a lot of wisdom to what she's saying, but at the same time, I do think that the amount of pressure that everyone is under to provide a modern lifestyle, not just for people here in this country, but also for the folks who aspire to the middle class around the world, is unyielding.
Yes, absolutely. One thing I really want to talk about, how many people in here feel eco-anxiety? Climate anxiety because of climate change? It's a real thing, right? As if we needed anything to create more anxiety in our modern lifestyles. I'm sure you guys also feel this. I want to ask you, how do you deal with your eco-anxiety, especially knowing all the things knowing a lot more than we do, and it's probably a lot scarier than we even think. How do you deal with that, and what gives you hope? I'd like to go in a line. And try to keep it brief, please.
So I don't know if folks saw this, but Wynne Bruce was a climate activist who self-immolated in front of the Supreme Court a few weeks ago. And I work a lot with young people who have been going on hunger strikes and have really, really pushed the edges of what you should be doing to your body if you want to survive. And so I spend a lot of time talking to people about the absolute critical need to keep ourselves whole. And that's actually one of the biggest things that we can do. There's no climate policy that's ever passed that could have passed without activists. So as activists, we have to keep ourselves whole, which means that we have to find the joy in activism, the joy in each other, but also means that we need to take space and time. And this also gets back to Indian heritage. We need people to meditate more. We need people to do yoga more. We need people to actually take a moment and sit with themselves so that there's enough space to imagine this beautiful future that we're working towards, where things are run by the sun and the wind instead of extractive industries that destroy people. You can't imagine that if you don't make the space in your mind to be able to do that. And so it's really important, just at a personal level, but also as a movement level, that we really take this very seriously. Our ancestors all did a lot of work to get us here, and whether or not we have kids, we are ancestors right now. What we do right now is is unbelievably important for the history of our species. We have to keep ourselves whole. It may be the biggest contribution we make is actually keeping ourselves whole. And so it's not, it's not as sexy as deployment, but I think meditation and yoga and breath are absolutely critical for the climate movement.
Absolutely. Self-care is important, people.
Yes.
Should we go in order? Manish, you want to go next?
Sure. I have a 15-year-old daughter who's like going on 19 and a 12-year-old son who's going on 9. But both, kids these days, right? I mean, they're just at a very different intellectual level than we were. Or I'm looking at some of you that are my age, not many here. So they just have an incredible knowledge and appreciation for a lot of these issues and a level of depth of understanding in a way that I don't think many of us did when we were in high school, looking at Jigar. But
I'm still young.
One of the things I've noticed with a lot of high school kids, not only are they quite knowledgeable and animated about these issues, but they're also there's a little bit of a kind of deep concern about is it going to be too late for that, right? By the time another 5-10 years, are we going to get locked into something that'll be very difficult to escape from? And I just say that observation because I think it's so important for us to kind of keep that window open and to keep their enthusiasm and their activism kind of focused and animated and energized. And I just think that we owe it. We just owe it to themselves. So this eco-anxiety, the risk of it, the climate anxiety, is that it could lead to a sense of just, fatalism. Are we going to be able to really solve this? And
inaction.
That, exactly. And so just how do we keep that? I think that's a huge, huge role for all of us. And just a quick quote that I came across. My son came home, and some of you may have heard this on Earth Day, and he said that something he heard in school, which I thought was just very powerful. He said, "Pessimists are right more often, optimists win more often." And again, not but in terms of something to just for us to all think about as we come forward.
Yes, I 100% agree. I think that the youth and the young people today, so many of you in this room, are the leaders, and it is truly the world that we are leaving behind for them, and it is our responsibility to make sure we don't screw it up for them, but it is their responsibility to correct the wrongs of the past and to teach the older people. So with that, I would love to ask Varun what he thinks about this.
I think the source of my anxiety and the source of my optimism is tipping points. Let me unpack that. At 2 a.m. on some arbitrary night, Secretary Kerry will text a tipping point. It is a calving of an ice sheet in Antarctica. He follows this closely. Tipping points are scary because the warming of the climate, the crazy impacts, as many of you know, could accelerate markedly based on some major event, a major emission of carbon or methane from the permafrost in Siberia or one of these ice shelves calving. So that scares me. But tipping points also give me optimism in a different way. We are seeing, so like if you look at all the math, the climate math on how we get to net zero, it doesn't make any sense. It's really expensive and it's going to take too long, and the countries haven't signed up for the right targets, so that doesn't make any sense. But if you look at what's happening with technology, sorry, I'm taking this back to technology. Something remarkable and nonlinear happens when a technology achieves cost parity with the conventional dirty alternative. That technology just takes off. We've now seen it repeated multiple times with light-emitting diodes, LEDs. These lights are probably LEDs. Solar panels, onshore wind turbines. We're seeing it with batteries. We're seeing it now. Electric cars hit 10% of global new sales last year. That's an insane number. There are 40 other technologies where this has to happen, and the reason that we're all so pessimistic is there are 40 technologies where we need the tipping points to be hit, and only a few where it has already been hit. And yet, looking at the example of what has happened to the technologies that have gotten cost competitive, you can foresee that in this decade, especially with the sorts of projects Jigar's doing, so sorry to harp on this, we really have a chance across these other 40 technologies to hit those tipping points, and then magical things just happen. And they accelerate faster than you ever would have imagined. So I think we got to keep our heads down and get these other 40 to the point where they're raking in billions and tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of private investment, and they're cost competitive. If we can get there, through investments that Jigar's making, through these commitments that first movers are making, this problem can actually be solvable, even if the math doesn't make sense right now.
Thank you.
On the walk over here, my assistant Haley and I were talking about how we keep it all together, right? There's a lot of stuff going on. I generally don't have anxiety, not because I'm inhuman, although it might be. It's more just that, if you study history, things have been a lot worse, right? I mean, during the flu, the Spanish flu, which I think shouldn't be called that, but whatever the flu is called these days, in 1916 to 18, people died so frequently of so many things, they weren't sure whether they died of the flu or they died of something else, right? And so, I just think that we glorify the past and think that it was just so freaking awesome. When we were first going back and forth to India, there was a smoking section in the back of the plane. I'm so glad that that's not there anymore. I think that the world is so much better today than it ever was in the past, right? And it's important for us to note that, like Winston Churchill said, right? America always does the right thing after it exhausts all other options. We are going to do that, right? This will get solved, right? To Varun's point, we have the technologies, we're going to get it done. The question is whether we do it in a way that actually protects people on the justice side, as Keya is suggesting, or whether we overshoot completely and we create huge human suffering, and then come back, which is what we normally do, right? That's what we did in World War II, when we all knew that this was going to happen and people were saying it was going to happen, but we're like, no, we need to actually fight a war. Look, I think that anxiety is natural, and some people have anxiety, and I totally get it. But to quote Frozen 2, I think you just have to do the next right thing, right? Every day you wake up, you figure out what your superpowers are, and you use them for good. And you work as hard as you can in the field of your choice, and you try to make the world a better place, right? And if all of us do that every day, we're going to get there. And I hope we shorten the amount of time it takes to get there, so we minimize the amount of suffering around the world. But Lord Almighty, we have a lot of suffering now, and we've always had suffering, right, in the world, right? And so, I agree with you, self-care. Please, take care of yourself, because we need you to do the next right thing.
Yeah, and thank you. Thank you for all of that. And I do think that it goes back to kind of what I said in the very beginning, that looking at our own individual roles. We can't all do everything. It's just not possible. And a lot of us have more privilege than other people in so many ways. But we can all do at least one thing. Turn off the lights when you leave the house. So many people leave the lights on. I can't understand it. It's the most basic thing you could do is turn the lights off.
There's an app for that now.
Oh, great. Download that app. So that's what I'm saying. We can all do something. And I would love everyone to just take that away from this panel today, is what can you do in your own personal life, in your own work? What can you bring up, at your place of work if you see something that is unsustainable or needs to be changed? I would love for you all to just kind of reflect on that. So thank you. And should we open it up to the audience?
So I think we
gotta.
I think we're way over.
Yeah, we gotta.
Pretty much ready to.
It's time for lunch. Please eat plant-based.
Yes, I think we'll have to close, but I think you all are around for a little bit. So if you have time, or if you have any questions, please bring them directly to our panelists, and just please give me a round of applause for everyone here.